first order of business for the police was to try and break up the big crowd. As officers moved in, they started to make arrests. The people taken into custody were young, in their teens and early 20s. Some were defiant of the cameras taking their pictures.
There was a little fight going on here, and cops started coming. I guess all the north side just got pissed off and started rocking them like crazy.
All of those arrested were taken to police headquarters downtown. They were booked and put in jail. Police are still putting together the arrest papers, but they say between 20 and 30 people were arrested.
What happened out there, Carlson?
I don't know. Everybody just went crazy because the police started some shit or something. I don't know what, I don't know what it was really about.
You know what happened out there?
Bottle, that's all. You just got to hit them with the bottle, man.
Shortly after 11 o'clock, police pulled out of the riot area. They thought things would cool down if they were not so readily visible to residents. They were partially wrong. Someone set a fire to a shopping center in the 2900 block of Fulton. 2 stores were destroyed. A food market had its windows busted, and there was some looting. By 3 a.m., most of the people had gone home. The police stayed. Roger O'Neill, Big 2 News.
This is what it looked like when Big 2 News reporters Phil Archer and Jack Cato were on their way to cover a knifing incident at Moody Park. All of a sudden, a bicycle was thrown at Archer, but he continued to use his camera. Then Archer and Cato ran, with the camera still on. All of a sudden, the camera shuts off. That's when Archer was stabbed. Cato came to help, and he also was stabbed and beaten. Some of the kids in the crowd tried to help Cato and Archer.
They stabbed him in the back, and he was pretty bad. He couldn't even walk. He was fainting. Thought he was going to die.
Cato was rushed to the hospital, but Archer had to wait for an ambulance. The crowd was standing in the way of emergency vehicles. Small bands of mostly young people rampaged the neighborhood. They broke store windows and they burned cars. They burned several police cars, and reporter Cato's news unit was also destroyed. Before long, there were hundreds of police officers near the park. Most were wearing full riot gear. Some were injured. The police chief was out of town, so Mayor Jim McCann was in command. He kept in close touch with the SWAT team. They decided to pull out all the uniformed officers and let SWAT stake out the area.
Park police were called to investigate a stabbing. That was about 8 o'clock. Big 2 News men Jack Cato and Phil Archer got there just as that minor incident developed into a major confrontation. Cato says one car had already been overturned and was burning.
When we got up to the car and started shooting pictures, the first thing we knew where it was going to be bad was when somebody threw a bicycle at us. And I grabbed Phil and we started to get out as quick as we could. Somebody grabbed his camera as I was running in front of him, and he pulled that out of the way. And I went to get the camera, and Phil had fallen down, and while I went to get the camera, they were kicking and hitting on Phil. And I grabbed the camera and was ready to go, and I was just going to get him to pick him up when it must have been the biggest brick I've ever seen hit me right over the left eye. And then I turned and started to get out of there because it was just wild. And going out about 10 feet from where Phil was still down, some kid ran up behind me. And I knew what he was doing, and I started to swerve from him. I was running, and I had the battery and the equipment, and I couldn't run that fast, and he just juked me, as they say, right in the back with a knife.
Cato went to the hospital with a head injury and a stab wound. Somebody set fire to the Big 2 News unit Cato had driven. The ambulance that was to take Archer was stoned, and a crowd blocked its way. So Archer was given emergency treatment on the scene. He has head and facial cuts and bruises, and a bad knife wound in the hip. While Archer was being treated, police were busy. Roger O'Neill says their first job was trying to break up the big crowd that had formed.
Small gangs of young people throwing rocks and bottles were defiant as the police arrived. Then the police began moving in and making arrests. All of those arrested were taken downtown, booked, and put in jail. 22 people under arrest.
What happened out there, Pauls?
I don't know, everybody just went crazy.
Uniformed police began pulling out of Moody Park around 11 o'clock. But then fires broke out in a shopping center. There was rifle fire reported as firemen tried to answer those alarms. The firemen did not come in until they were escorted by the police. There was also some looting, and by the time it was over, the 2900 block of Fulton looked like a tornado had moved through. Roger O'Neill, Big 2 News.
Alan Parcell and Ken Cockcroft spent the rest of the night on Fulton Street. Police figured bright television lights were an invitation to more trouble, so these films were made with a special night scope, as members of the SWAT team stood by to handle any trouble.
They weren't needed. Apparently, the anger of the people had already been vented. The damage had already been done. 3 stores had been destroyed by fire, others were ransacked and windows were smashed. And as dawn broke over the troubled area, bewildered and frightened shop owners began to appraise their loss. More evidence of the night of violence sits in a lot at Fulton and Patton Streets. A Big 2 News mobile unit, a police cruiser, and a fire department car are ruined. Alan Parcell, Big 2 News.
In all, more than a dozen people were hurt. Their injuries range from minor to serious. 22 people were arrested, and police spent most of today sorting out the charges.